going to talk a lot of things about livestock tonight. And one of the first things, I hope this is going to work. One of the first things I want to talk about when you're working with any animal, doesn't matter what animal it is, even doing veterinary work on a dog or a cat, a calm animal is easier to handle. Once an animal gets all scared, it takes half an hour for them to calm back down. So the secret is, don't get them upset in the first place. Another little secret is, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a non-slip floor in a handling facility. Animals panic when they start to slip. They seem like a small thing, but it's not a small thing. You've all walked on ice. It's not good. Let's keep them calm. Now, how do we know when horses and cattle are calm or they're getting all excited and they're getting all scared? And when they get agitated, it's fear. Like the fear circuits in animals' brains have been completely mapped. When you got nice, soft brown eyes on cattle and horses, then they're calm. And when they start to get scared, you'll start to see the whites of their eyes. There's actually been scientific research on this. And how do scientists figure out that when the whites of the eyes show, the animal's getting scared? Because you can stop it with Valium. I'm not recommending you do that. Ears are forward. When the ears go back. Also watch what they're looking at with the ears. The tail's switching. Tail is switching. In cattle and horses, they're getting upset. That's your early warning before it kicks you or it bucks you off. Heads up looking around. Ones with a really high temperament, heads up looking around, ears pinned back. We want to get you more aware of what that animal is doing. Be better observers. And that's also going to help really improve safety, too, in working with livestock. Now, some of the very first work I did was to look for all of the little distractions that animals are afraid of. I found if you get rid of distractions, like a chain hanging down in a chute, a shadow, a reflection, I always get asked all the time, do cattle know they're going to get slaughtered? In fact, I get this thing back from Grandin.com on my website, and like 8 people had typed into Google, do animals know they're going to die? And that's a question that I had to answer very early in my career. So I'd go over to the local Swift plant and watch the cattle going up the chute, and then I would go over to the feedlot and watch the cattle going up into the squeeze chute, and they behaved the same way in both places. If they knew that they were going to die, they would be much more upset at the slaughter plant. No, they're afraid of things like the dark. If I put a light on the chute entrance, they go right up the chute. Now, one of the big problems that eggs got today is they're not communicating with the public. One thing that really frustrates me, I've worked a long time really working on improving slaughter plants. Well, the public still thinks they're bad. Just before I came here, I had a freshman call me, a freshman English major. Well, her only source of information was an animal activist website. And I explained to her that a lot of things have improved. You need to look at some other websites, look at some other books. One of the things we need to be doing is showing people what we do. 2.5 years ago, I put my stunning videos and meat plant handling videos up on YouTube. The industry had a gigantic fit. Well, I find that the public's just curious. Because when I went out to Hollywood, you know what the Hollywood press wanted to talk about? What is a feedlot? How do slaughter plants work? They just want to know. And one of the big problems we have with the internet today is it makes radicals on both sides of an issue have a gigantic voice. We got to start talking to all the just regular people out there in the middle. It's been really interesting being out on the road. And I find that people are really surprised when they find out things like McDonald's actually audits slaughter plants. And they've been doing it for the last 10 years. It's really very frustrating to me, work on cleaning up slaughterhouses, and I'm not going to call them harvest plants. I think that's BS. I found that the S word was just fine out in Hollywood. In just a real matter-of-fact way, you got to show what you're doing. And if you're doing something that really makes you squirm, maybe you're going to need to change it. And I have found, I've taken a lot of people through well-run slaughter plant, and they're kind of amazed at how calmly the cattle walk up the chute. They kind of go, oh, well, that's not so bad. Now let's look at things that, when animals get into a novel environment, that's going to stop their movement. Changes in the type of floor. Now, if you have a dairy cow that's used to walking over 2 different kinds of floor, she's going to walk right over it. But you got a beef animal, goes into a new facility, it's going to stop. Give it an opportunity to stop and put the head down. Because if you just push them up there, they're going to turn back on you. Here's a bad situation. We got a lot of reflections. You can get time of day effects, where maybe truck loading in the morning works just great. Truck loading in the late afternoon's terrible because the sun's coming up over the top of the truck. So maybe you change the time that you load by 2 hours so you don't blind them. Livestock have a tendency to go from a dark place to a brighter place. Like you can light up inside a building at night, light up the inside of a trailer, and they'll tend to go in. But they're not going to go into blinding light. You've all been on the freeway where the sun's coming up and it's just blinding you. Well, an animal doesn't want to go into that, neither do you. So the first work I ever did, I got down in the chutes to see what cattle were seeing. People thought that was really crazy to look at what cattle were seeing. And people often ask me, well, how did autism help me in my work with animals? I'm an extreme visual thinker. The HBO movie did a great job of showing how I think visually, and Amazon does have it. Maybe I shouldn't have brought that up, but I did. And, but to me, as a complete visual thinker, it seemed obvious to me to look at what cattle were seeing. And I found at one feed yard, this working facility worked great, and then I had it was the same design, and another feed yard, it worked badly. And it was due to the orientation to the sun. You got people standing there. Well, those people have either got to get out of the way, or they're going to need to put solid side up there. Where it's really important to put solid sides up is on perimeters of things. Where there's feed trucks going by. There's people standing deep in the flight zone. Look at how that animal is avoiding walking on the sunbeam. I want to get you aware of those sorts of things. If one of the things I want you to do is be observant. What's the animal sound like? What is he looking at? If he's pooping, he's probably scared. Don't want him doing that. This is what I call the black hole effect. It's real sunny outside, and inside this cattle handling facility, this building is real super dark. And on a sunny day, this doesn't work very well. And the problem I've got, if I try to light this up with electric lights, it doesn't work. The sun's 100 times brighter than any electric light I can buy. That electric light will work for attracting them in at night. It works great. What I got to do in this building is I got to rip tin off. I got to get natural daylight in there. If you're building a new facility, strongly recommend white translucent skylights. I went into a fantastic dairy where their entire milking parlor had concrete walls up to about here, and then the whole top part was translucent garage doors that they could open up in the summertime, and it made it so bright. Because what you want is nice, shadow-free natural light. Now, this is a place that's been retrofitted, and they've put in white translucent panels. So now the cattle see that natural light, but it doesn't have shadows. And one place where you really need to have solid is this crowd gate. Most important gate in the whole thing, no matter what your design is your crowd gate. So they don't tend to turn back on you and cram the gate back into your face. Do they know they're going to get slaughtered? I show this slide all the time to my students. And I say, tell me something that's wrong in this slide. And they'll point out about the chain there, okay? One thing that's good is you got the white translucent panels. But there's something else really wrong in this slide that I find that over half my students don't see it. Sometimes the most obvious is the least obvious. Well, how about the 3 guys standing right where they shouldn't be standing? Where you're driving the cattle right into the 3 guys. And one of them's got mirrored sunglasses on. That's going to make him really scary. You got to get the people out of there. Okay. Show some of my curved facilities. And one advantage of a curve is animals have a natural tendency to go back to where they came from. So you want to use that natural behavior. Outer perimeter, that's the most important part of it to have solid, unless you're out in the middle of nowhere. But if you're where there's any distractions. Another thing that a curved chute does is it cuts down on the amount of walking, because you can cut across the circle. People don't like to walk. And I'm really pleased that there's so much more interest today in low-stress livestock handling. I think that's really great. But all of these methods require more walking, moving smaller groups of animals. And I get very frustrated because, you know, they do it when I'm there, but then when my back's turned, then they're bringing up too many cattle. In a meat packing plant where we got a lot of distractions, we want to cover everything up and make it completely solid. Another advantage of that curved chute is as those animals enter, they don't see all the people standing around the squeeze chute because they tend to not want to approach visible people. Now you've got to lay these things out right, and I don't think this has a pointer. Yeah, it does have a pointer. Good. You got to lay it out right because when an animal is standing right there, he's got to be able to see up their 2 body lengths. If you bend it too sharp right here, it will not work. That's what I call dead-ending the chute. And I have a book called Humane Livestock Handling, where I've got all the drawings in it. They did have a few copies here they've sold out, but the bookstore can order them. It's Humane Livestock Handling. But this is the real critical part of the design. Another thing in laying out a tub is you want to go around in a full half circle. So you take advantage of the natural tendency to go back to where they came from. Now I went down and visited the sheep unit just right here on the campus, and it's really nice. It goes around with a full half circle. Because little tubs where it's sort of a quarter circle and kind of goes like that, those are kind of useless. But you want to get a situation where you come on around and you get that following behavior. Another important design feature is you want to make sure you have enough single file lead-up chute space so I can use following behavior. You know, if that lead-up chute only holds like 2 cows in there, I can't get any following behavior. Because I like to wait until the chute's almost empty and then bring up 5 or 6 animals and fill up the chute. Then I'm using following. Now you'll notice right here, he's got the backstop tied up. People tend to put in too many backstops. Right there at that entrance, if you got that backstop gate down, they won't go in. So another handy thing you can do is put a remote control rope on that. Then you can work that from over in the crowd pen. And you're not making all those cattle go clumping through it. I'm kind of amazed sometimes how I can fix up a facility with simple things like a remote control rope, blocking up the side where they can see a reflection on a truck. People working with animals need to understand flight zone. If you have a tame calves like I saw being fitted for showing today, they got no flight zone. You can touch them, you can groom them. These sheep have got some flight zone. And if you have an animal that's jumping up in the chute, it's doing that because you're too close. Back up. Back up and get out of the flight zone. Don't try to push it back down. That's going to make the animal even more crazy. Now, people have been doing a lot more selection for temperament, and we're getting calmer cattle today. We've done some work looking at little hair whorls that cattle have on their foreheads, and when cattle have a real high up hair whorl, tend to be more flighty. And over the last 15 years, people have been selecting for calmer. So we got less of those real crazy cattle. Well, we better be careful because some of these calmer cattle might be less vigilant on protecting their baby. See, there's always a trade-off. I want to get rid of the nutcases, but you wouldn't necessarily want to select for the absolute most dead, calm animals. Okay, here's a handy-dandy way to get them in the squeeze chute without so many prods. Imagine this is the tailgate to the squeeze chute. So I stand here, tailgate opens, and I quickly, just like this, walk back by the shoulder of the next animal in line. And when I walk back by him in the opposite direction of desired movement, the quick movement, it often makes them go forward. That sounds kind of counterintuitive. A basic principle, this works out on pasture too, is when you walk in the opposite direction of desired movement in the flight zone, they tend to go forward. Now, when you're in a chute situation like this, the point of balance will be right here at the shoulder, when you're up real close to them. The mistake that people make is they stand here at the head and poke the butt. I got to get people to stop doing that. So, okay, they might stand back here and then poke the butt, and that often works, but it doesn't work as well as just going like this. Now, when you're up real close in the chute, that point of balance is going to be at the shoulder. You've got to get behind the shoulder to make them go forward. Now, if you're further out away, let's say you're out here somewhere, you may move along, and the point of balance may be just past the eye. The eye is, you get further away, the point of balance tends to move forward. But the point of balance is never in front of the eye. It's got to be somewhere from behind the eye to the shoulder. And when you get in real close, I find when we're working up close in shoots, I've got to tell them at the shoulder, otherwise they don't reliably go forward. Okay, right there I'm using a stick with a flag on it to turn an animal. I want people to be real calm with this thing. I'm talking about doing very slight movements. I want to get rid of all the yelling and screaming. The first thing we got to do on low stress handling is we got to get everybody to calm down. Yelling and screaming at cattle is extremely, extremely stressful. It's more stressful than the sound of a gate slamming because they know you're screaming at them. So all the yelling and screaming and all the flapping around. And what do I think about electric prod use? Get it out of your hand. Sometimes you might have a stubborn animal that won't go in the squeeze chute, and it's better to pick up the prod and use it than be bending her tail off or hitting her. But you should not be carrying the electric prod around in your hand. Something else should be the thing for your hand. Now notice here that this round crowd pen is filled half full. Good cattle handling requires more walking. Now sheep, on the other hand, are the ultimate follower. I can just move them in continuous flow. But for cattle and pigs, you want to move small, separate groups. And I'm constantly fighting people putting too many cattle in the crowd pen. So what you want to do is you wait until there's space in the chute and then just bring the cattle up around here and pass on through. You want to use a crowd pen as a passing through pen. And if you really want to follow good low-stress handling techniques, you know, one thing you got to have is enough lead-up chute space. Okay, let's say you got a little portable panel thing. It's got little straight chutes, 2 cows long. Once you get a couple more panels and make the lead-up a bit longer, then that's a simple thing you can do that can really improve handling. Now notice that crowd gate's just on the first notch. You don't need to be pushing and shoving with the crowd gate. Also notice he's standing back, because if he stands here, they won't go in. Now, half full. If your crowd pen holds 10 stuffed, you bring up 5. If it holds 30 stuffed, you bring up 15. Half full means half full. Now the big packing plants now, some of the big companies now have video auditing, where auditors over the internet can look at what's going on in the crowd pen. And I had a chance to go to AeroSite Mission Control, where video cameras are hooked up to 23 of the large plants, and I could look in and see what was going on at their unloading ramp and their crowd pens and their stunning area. And my favorite plant that I'd worked so hard on with low-stress handling, that had a new manager that seemed to be so interested in it, 30 cattle jammed in the crowd pen and 2 hot shots in the crowd pen. They don't even need to have electric prods in that crowd pen. I was so mad, so mad. Especially because it was that particular plant. And I had just been down there working with them on handling. People don't want to walk. That's why they were jamming all those cattle in there. Because the good handling is going to require a lot more walking. Okay, what are the ears doing? Look at how the zebra and the horse have an ear on each other. The other ear's on me. Watch those ears. They point their ears towards things they're concerned about. I want you to watch for those kind of things. Okay, here are some principles of restraint. Non-slip flooring, we already talked about that. And I went over to your meats lab today. I'm not going to call it the harvest facility. I really think that's BS. I use the S word in Hollywood. It goes over just fine. And your stun box, your beautiful brand new stun box, the floor is too slippery. And what happens when you have a floor that's too slippery, after they pee in there, then they start jigging. And they just start doing their foot like this in the panic. And you're going to need to put a steel grating in there. You can go on Grandin.com. I've got a picture in there that shows exactly how to build the grating. You've got to weld the rods this way, not on top of each other. And you know what? They're going to settle right down in that stun box, and then it's going to work just fine. I'm amazed at what I can do with non-slip flooring. Jerky motion scares. Sudden jerky motion scares. Both seeing it and feeling it. And one thing that was really cool at the movie site is they had this big camera that's called a giraffe with a hot head. Big camera boom. And it just moves smooth as silk like this. And you know what? You can put that right over the top of a herd of cattle, and it's like it's not there. Because it doesn't do jerky motion. Optimal pressure. Animal struggles, they tend to squish it too hard. And that's true whether you have a hydraulic squeeze chute or you're holding a cat. And non-slip flooring. Okay, if you're going to become veterinarians, let's give the dog a non-slip floor to stand on so he's not slipping around. And if you use a blindfold to block vision, it's got to be completely opaque. T-shirt, that doesn't work. Not opaque enough. Oh, don't tell me this isn't going to work. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to just talk some about temperament. We did some of the very first studies on looking at temperament and weight gain. Boy, when we did this stuff, it was looked at like we were crazy. And a cattle that scored a 4, the ones that try to come out the top of the squeeze chute, they had less weight gain. This has been replicated. I like to do the pioneering stuff. We did the hair whirl stuff. One of the first journal article reviewer wrote back and said that was silly and it wasn't science. You're going to reject our paper. Well, now we've got people involved in all kinds of highfalutin genetic stuff citing that paper now. You know, I tell my students if a paper gets rejected, there's 3 reasons. It's an absolute piece of garbage. It's so new that nobody believes it, or it's pure politics. Yeah, that's your 3 reasons why papers get rejected. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is an important slide because I want to really get the idea across to you about handling stress. Okay, high cortisol levels and rough handling. That gets a lot of cortisol, a lot of stress. You do calmer handling with the cattle, then you get less fear stress. Why is the dairy cow lower? Because the dairy cow is trained. This brings up a very important principle. When animals voluntarily cooperate, you cut down the fear stress. So one of the things that's being taught in many of the low stress handling workshops now is to take young heifers and practice going through the chute. Let's make first experiences coming into the corrals good first experiences, not bad first experiences. And right there we've got trained antelope. That was another thing that was supposed to be totally impossible. We trained antelope to voluntarily cooperate and get blood samples and shots in return for food treats. Okay, next slide. An animal's first experience with something new needs to be good. Make sure that your horse's first experience with a horse trailer is a good first experience. Because if that first experience is bad, he's going to be afraid of it. And you can get a fear memory. And that fear memory is something the animal either was hearing or looking at the moment that it happened. Like there was an elephant that hated diesel-powered. Man, if it ran with a diesel, it was bad. If it ran with gas, it was fine. Another animal was afraid of long sticks. Anything that was a long, straight thing, because he'd been hit with sticks. An animal knows the difference between the good person's voice and the bad person's voice. They pick up on things that happened right when the bad thing happened. And we need to be working more on acclimating animals to different handling procedures. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the thing about a new experience or something new, things that are new are both scary and attractive. They are attractive when the animal can voluntarily approach. And they are scary if you corner the animal and shove it in their face. I call that the paradox of novelty. So I put that clipboard down there and all the cattle came up to it. Wind blows the paper, they back up. The paper stops blowing, they come back. And I used to call that curiously afraid. And you can see in 1998 when we were first fooling around doing this, and I thought, there's got to be like a switch in the brain. Because they act like they're either fearful or they're attracted to it. The switch has now been found. NIH funded research on drug addiction. They found the switch in the nucleus accumbens. Brain can either go to seek or it can go to fear. It can switch back and forth. Genetically flighty animals, the switch tends to be more balanced towards fear. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if you have animals with really calm genetics, you can introduce something suddenly you don't get scared. Because a common test is opening an umbrella suddenly, a novel stimulus. There's been some interesting research now done in France that just came out this year on, well, do the cattle know they're going to die? Most of that fear you get at the slaughter plant is fear of novelty. Because animals that would get really scared when you popped an umbrella in their face out at the farm are the same animals that had higher heart rate and had higher stress responses at the slaughter plant. It's fear of novelty. It's not fear of getting slaughtered. Let's go to the next slide. Man on a horse, man on the ground. Cattle view that as two totally different things. I've seen some really dangerous situations where you have cattle that might have a 2-foot flight zone and they're real super gentle when they're worked on a horse, but then when you handle them on foot, they scatter. It's important that they get trained to both. Because I do a lot of work with the meat plants, and I've seen some real dangerous stuff where you've had cattle come in, never been worked on foot, and they've run over some people at the plant. Because now you've got a 50-foot flight zone in a 20-foot pen. That's not a safe situation. So I think it's important to get cattle habituated to four-wheelers, horses, on foot. They need practice going in and out of pens, and make sure when you first introduce the new thing, it's done in a calm, careful way. One of the best ways to introduce the animals to a four-wheeler would be just to bring it out in the field and let them come up and sniff it. But don't bring it out and then chase them with it. Because I just recently talked to some people where the cattle had been so terrorized with a four-wheeler that I don't think they're going to be able to use a four-wheeler on that herd. I mean, half the herd is absolutely, totally scared of them. And we've got to work on preventing fear memories. Because you have a horse that's really scared of something. I just talked to some people this afternoon who were discussing a horse that kicks when you cinch it up. Otherwise, it's a perfect riding horse. It's just when you cinch it up. Well, it was abused. Probably kicked in the gut a whole bunch of times, and it doesn't forget that. That's the problem. And unfortunately, I am going to have to put a cinch on it. Now, for the horse, man on the ground, man on the horse, two different file folders in the animal's brain. I've seen horses where they were fine for veterinarian shoeing, buck you off when you ride them, because the abuse had happened with riding. Or you could have just the opposite. Riding's bad, on the ground's good. Now, when you think about it, it's a different picture. See, an animal is a sensory-based thinker. They store their memories as pictures, as sounds, as touch sensations. I've seen several horses where you use a one-piece bit, they act just fine. Use a jointed snaffle, they're going berserk. And the reason for that is they were abused with one of those horrible twisted wired jointed snaffles. So now all jointed bits are bad. But I want you to go down in the tack room and take some different kinds of bits, hold them in your hand, and think about how they feel differently. Because sometimes a horse is afraid of a particular kind of bit, I can just get rid of it. That's like an easy way. If I can like eliminate the thing they're afraid of. But if you have a horse that's afraid of sticks, that's going to be hard. I can't get rid of all the show sticks and things like that. Microphone stands, you're going to have that stuff around. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk about measuring animal welfare. Because I've gotten very frustrated, going to places, I build nice facilities. Half my clients tore up the stuff and wrecked it. And the only thing that kept me going is there were a few clients that really did things right. And when I first started my career, I thought I could fix everything with equipment. I can only fix half of the problems with equipment. The other things I got to fix with management. So then I spent more and more time training managers. I've gotten where I don't want to train the employees. I got to convince the managers that good handling is really important. Now, I'm a PACO auditor trainer. I train the people that audit the plants that are hired by people like McDonald's and Wendy's to audit plants to make sure they do things right. And when we started doing that 10 years ago, it resulted in more change than I'd seen in a 25-year career prior to that. And I was also amazed at how we took some of the old junky plants and I fixed them. Because I had to figure out a way to fix these plants without spending a fortune. I was amazed at what, steel rods in the floor of the stun box? I was amazed how that worked. Rubber tire mats put out on the unloading dock. Amazing. It's amazing what you can do with cardboard and plywood, and portable lights, and moving lights, and changing how people handle the cattle. I fixed most of the old plants. And out of 75 plants on the McDonald's approved supplier list, only 3 had to do complete makeovers, expensive remodels. Everybody else we fixed with the simple things. And I wrote up a really simple scoring system. I didn't tell plants how they had to build their facilities. They had to achieve certain outcomes. This is a different way of looking at things. Are we going to tell people how to do things, I don't care whether it's health care or whether it's education. We need to be looking more at what kind of outcomes that we're getting on things. And by doing this measurement, it prevents bad from becoming normal. Because some of these plants that went back to like jamming 30 cattle in the crowd pen, and it actually was a year later that I looked at the video, they regress back slowly into these old bad habits. I call it bad becoming normal. How did the dairy industry get up to 25% lame cows? That happened slowly. I'm very happy that the cows here are really good on lameness. And so we got to measure handling. We got to measure things like handling to keep it good. Go to the next slide. And when we're developing systems for measuring and for evaluating things, we got to get rid of these vague words like adequate, proper, and sufficient. What does that mean? You see, the normal human mind tends to oversimplify. There's been research that shows that's true. It tends to get too abstract. I don't know what proper handling is. Your idea of proper handling might be very different than mine. Maybe hot shot 10 times on every animal. Some people might think that's proper handling. I think that's just terrible. You need to be writing guidelines so that they'll be interpreted the same way by different people. Let's go to the next slide. This is an example of a well-written guideline. All the pigs have to have enough room to all lay down without being on top of each other. You got to write something that's clear. You don't just say, give them enough room. Next slide. Okay, let's look at things for scoring animal handling on a ranch. I want animals moving at a walk and a trot, not at a run. So what percentage of the cattle were moved at a walk and a trot? How many animals fell down during handling? I hope none. But if you've got animals falling down and ramming into things, that's not very good. How many animals vocalize? That's one of the ones that really worked in the plants. To pass a McDonald's audit, you're allowed to only have 3 cattle in the stunning chute moo. And if more than 3 cattle moo, you fail the audit. And why was vocalization a good measure? Because when you do bad things, they moo. Poke them with a prod, more likely to moo. Nutcracker their head in the squeeze chute, they're going to moo. Now, obviously, if you brand them, they're going to moo. So when you're doing this for a handling audit, you measure, can I get them into the squeeze chute and get them caught? Can I catch them without them mooing? If they moo and you catch them, then you're hurting them with a squeeze chute. And if they're mooing back in the snake or whatever kind of chute you have because you prod them all up, that's something bad that needs to stop. And then how many animals did you use the electric prod on? Now, some people say, well, I just ban them. I've seen too many cattle abused when they absolutely wouldn't go in the squeeze chute. I'm the one who picked up the electric prod before somebody broke a tail off. But then, get it out of your hand and put it away. Let's go to the next slide. This is the very simple scoring system that we used for scoring the plants. We measure 5 simple outcome variables. This uses what's called a HACCP approach, which stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. What are the really important things that I need to measure? Okay, how many cattle did I shoot with the stunner on a single shot? It's got to be 95% to pass. I got to get them all insensible. How many did I poke with the electric prod? How many were mooing in the stunning area? How many fell down? That's measured at unloading, and it's measured going up the stunning chute. But you see, these are outcomes. They can moo due to prods, they can moo to a misstun, they can moo to a gate being slammed on them, a restraint device that squashes them, that'll make them moo. These are outcome variables. You don't see anything in here about equipment design. I deliberately took all the design stuff out of it. We're not going to tell them how to make a floor, but they got them that if they have more than 1% of the cattle fall, they fail the audit, and then they better fix the floor. That's what they're going to need to do. And everything's on a per animal basis. Was the prod used on that cow, yes or no? Did it moo, yes or no? It's very, very simple. Very easy to train people. Because I got to have something where I can train people in a day-and-a-half workshop. That's the reality. Let's go to the next slide. Now the thing that's good about this is whether I audit that plant or you audit the plant, we're getting the same scores. That's what's called inter-observer reliability. Let's go to the next slide. Now in 1996, only 30% of the plants could pass the stunning audit. You know why they couldn't pass it? Lack of maintenance. They simply didn't take care of the equipment. Well, now they're doing a lot better job. They've got test stands, they've got documented maintenance programs. 2010 data, 100% of the plants passed on the stunning audit. You can go on Grandin.com and look at all the figures from these audits. You manage things that you measure. And the thing that's good about measurement is I can tell, am I getting worse or am I getting better? Now what we've been finding with the video auditing is that people tend to fake good when the person with the clipboard is out there. And what we found is the stunning doesn't change. That's so dependent on the maintenance of the equipment. It's the handling. Backs turn, the prods come out. Hate to say it. Happened in a whole bunch of different plants. And then they were doing their internal audits, and some of them sort of did some fake stuff on that. It's the handling. It's constant vigilance. And what I have found on cattle handling is there's about 20% of people that just always stay good. They're the natural, low-stress stockmanship people. Then I can train most others, and there's about 10% that shouldn't be out there with cattle because they like to do bad things to them. And I know that's not nice, but that's what we found since the video auditing has been put in. Let's go to the next slide. The principle is you measure a small number of critical control points that measure a multitude of problems. It's a very simple concept. Let's say we applied that to schools. Well, I got three things. Get really good scores on international tests, stay out of trouble with the law, get and keep decent jobs. Well, that would be a pretty good outcome measure. You see, I learned a lot from this, to look at problems in kind of a different way. And the principle is you got to pick out critical control points that are easy to measure, that measure a multitude of problems. I'm not going to tell them what kind of stunning equipment to use or what kind of cattle handling equipment to use. They've got to make these measures. And then we do have a few things that are forbidden. You can't do things like hang cattle up by the ankle. You can't drag down. So there's some stuff that's forbidden. But as long as you don't do that stuff, you're free to design it however you want. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing is, it's not a paperwork audit. There's a tendency today to change everything into a paperwork audit. Oh, let me tell you, people are good at faking paperwork. I've worked in the construction industry, the fake bids and, saw all that stuff, the fake truckers' logbooks, seen all that stuff. The other thing is, we're looking at stuff that's directly observable. I want practical. And anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, I've got a book I've done with Cabby called Improving Animal Welfare, A Practical Approach. It's the title of the book. It tells you how to set up auditing programs. Let's go on to the next slide. Well, I can also use the measurements to show how simple changes improve the animal handling. You cannot have air blowing in their face. You got air blowing in their face, they won't go up the chute. So I changed the ventilation in the plant, and I went from 4.5% vocalizing down to 0 because I didn't have to prod them all the time. Let's go to the next slide. This one was for pigs, and I just lit up the entrance with a light that I taped to the entrance of the chute with duct tape. And we went from 38% down to 4%. All I did was stick a light on the entrance of the chute. The other thing we got to get people to do is to use behavior and not force. And this is a hard concept for some people to get their head around. It still amazes me how one little light makes such a big difference. Go on to the next slide. Now this is my center track restrainer system. You've got that in the plant right here in Hiram. In fact, half the cattle in this country, when they're handled in a meat plant, they're handled in my center track restrainer system. Now right here, we've got a non-slip ramp. Notice how it looks a lot like the dip that entrance in the movie? And that thing with the metal plate in the movie, that actually happened. They drowned those cattle, and they didn't even try to use it. They just assumed it wouldn't work. Where you let the cattle walk in. Now, 35 years later, I got people making the same mistake. This year, in 2010, I had one plant cut their ramp in half. Another plant took the cleats off. And the one that took the cleats off I'm really annoyed at because they let their light break. And instead of replacing their light, they messed around with the ramp. You see, and I think some of this problem is they're not seeing the behavior. Well, they need to watch the segment in the movie about the design of the ramp. It's exactly the same thing. You get it lighted right. You also have to have a false floor here. So they don't see it, this whole thing is 7 feet above the floor. This gets back to the work I did with optical illusions. And you control what they see, and then they'll walk right in there. Well, after the next slide, Now, one of the problems you've got to make sure you don't have is what's called the visual cliff. And when I took psychology, I studied the visual cliff. And both animals and babies don't want to walk out over a plate glass that's 4 feet above the ground. And you get things right. And the visual cliff and the fear of falling is a primal fear. Because I had a chance to go to a virtual reality room. Okay, I walk into this thing, it looks like the set of a weather thing at a TV station. Very fake looking. And obviously there weren't any holes in the floor or anything like that. So you put on this helmet, and the next thing I know, I'm on this balcony. And they're going to push me off this balcony. And I yelled and I fell down. I was standing on a wooden floor in front of a paper thing like you have for the weather deal at a TV station. I knew it was fake. I saw it before I put the helmet on. But that's such a powerful effect that I reacted to that. And I've read scientific papers where people react to that. And they know there's no trap door in the floor. And they try to push somebody into a trap door. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, put a light on the entrance. I went from 8% mooing down to 0%. Here's the false floor. 9% mooing down to 0. Another one where I had a head gate that squashed their neck. I make it looser. They stop mooing. This is simple things. I want to get you thinking about this because I know a lot of people today don't want to build a lot of really expensive things. Let's go on to the next slide. There's the light. But you got to make sure it doesn't break. Oh, that frustrated me. And I couldn't believe some of the stuff they did. And the thing is, it was well-intentioned. I'm really beginning to see that they're not seeing it. Sometimes the most obvious is the least obvious. I read about the Japanese nuclear power plant disaster, and I go, how could they do this? How could they put the emergency generators that run the backup pump that keeps the reactors from burning up in the basement? You live next to the sea. What's going to happen to those generators in the basement? They're going to go underwater. And they don't work when they're underwater. And that's why 4 nuclear power plants burned up. That's the reason. The earthquake came, and on at least 3 of the plants, the generators came on and everything was working. Not sure of one of them. I've had to piece a lot of stuff together in the papers. They've not released all the drawings on it. But why didn't they have submarine doors? Sometimes the most obvious is the least obvious. Chernobyl's even stupider. A nuclear power plant, that naked nuclear power plant, no containment building. And then you decide you're going to do a test and you're going to turn off all your safety systems? You know, I had a saying when I was working all the time in construction, never underestimate the laziness or the stupidity of people operating equipment. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, we get into slaughter plants pretty nice, but I've got a welfare issue I'm getting really worried about now. And that's how the animals behave coming into the plant. Pigs that have been fed so much ractopamine that they're really, really weak. Cattle that are so super wild, where they haven't been handled on foot. Those are real super dangerous to handle. Animals that have been jacked up on too many beta agonists and ractopamine, those kind of products, and they're coming in heat stressed, coming in lame. Old dairy cows that are half dead. You know, we're getting to where we're going to have to push back down the supply chain. You've got to give me an animal I can handle, not something that's crazy, weak, half dead, or heat stressed. Let's go to the next slide. And there's different kinds of variables. And what I've been talking about so far is animal-based guideline. You know, it's an outcome measure. And then you have a few things you just ban. And the old way of looking at things is all these engineering things, where you're telling people exactly how to do things. There's a few engineering things I need, like maybe ammonia levels, indoor buildings. There's a few things like that I'm going to need. But I don't want to get into the minutia telling you how to build stalls for dairy cows. I'd rather measure the outcome. Lameness, hot lesions. That's the outcome if there's something wrong with your stalls. Let's go to the next slide. Well, these are outcome measures I want to measure on a dairy. How many skinny cows have I got? How about lameness? There's a zillion different things that make lameness. You're doing stuff, bad management, I'll catch you on the lameness score when they're walking out of the parlor. How many filthy, dirty ones? How many have sores, like neglected cancer eyes in cattle? How about co-condition for you organic guys? No, it's not okay to have lice and bald spots and ringworm on calves. No, that's not all right. I've seen some bad becoming normal on that. How about ammonia levels in indoor facilities and abnormal behavior? These are very basic things that I'd want to measure on any farm. And they're simple things. They're easy to measure. Let's go to the next slide. Now, lameness is a good outcome measure because look at all the different things that can make a cow lame. So when I'm doing an audit, which is kind of like a screening tool for problems, it's up to the veterinarians and the animal scientists to fix the lameness. But I can pinpoint that there's a problem. Lameness scoring, I can pinpoint many different problems. Let's go to the next slide. Well, then there's some things we're going to have to get rid of. The public is simply not going to accept sow gestation stalls. Let's get rid of them. And we're going to need to change some pig genetics. Get some pigs that get along better with each other and don't fight so much. As we've been 25 years, pigs living in boxes, so there's been no selection pressure for pigs that don't fight. You know, the small chicken cages. There's some good things out there. Fair Oaks Farm, doing a fantastic job on educating the public. They got a calf cam. You can go to JS West, look at their chicken cam. I'm getting to the point now where we need to be just streaming it all out to the internet. Because if we don't show it, other people are going to show it for us. And remember my freshman that I just talked to, freshman English major, and the website's, she's not, you know, she doesn't even know how to search scientific databases. In fact, I explained to her about the PubMed database, Science Direct, Google Scholar. She didn't even know those things existed. Well, this gets into critical thinking and really digging into things. Let's go to the next slide. Well, and these are a few input measures that you need. There's still a few things where, you know, space requirements. There's a few engineering measures. But we need to be getting away from minutia of telling people exactly how to build things and go more towards outcome measures. Let's go to the next slide. That's my website, Grandin.com. I got lots and lots of information on there. And hopefully now we've got some time for some questions, because I always like to do some questions. And it's just great to have everybody here.
Thank you, Dr. Grandin, for coming to Utah State. That was a very inspiring talk, and it's a truly a dream come true to see you talk live. My question concerns management. You mentioned that good and bad managers have a lot to do with how animal welfare is implemented in systems.
Yes.
If managers don't get on board with the idea of animal welfare, in your mind, what's the most effective way to change that behavior? Is it incentive programs? Is it sanction?
In the McDonald's program 10 years ago, out of 75 plants, 3 plant managers were fired or retired. Management has got to buy into doing things right. And it's not just animal welfare. The other thing is economic incentives. I did a study where I looked at bruises on cattle. I know how to get rid of bruises. When people have to pay for them, you get rid of them. It's that simple. I looked at live weight cattle versus carcass weight cattle. And when the feedlots had to pay for the bruises, guess what? They got rid of them. Okay, weak pigs that you can't handle, weak, awful pigs. Now one plant got rid of them. The $25 expenses fee for the use of the Bobcat loader to move the pigs around. I visited that plant just a few weeks ago. Their pigs were really good. 2 years ago, their pigs were awful. Well, then the farmer's going to make sure his pigs are strong enough to walk off the truck and walk up to the stunner. Economic incentives have a really big effect. But there's some managers where things don't change until management gets changed. See, now in big corporations, it's much easier to get rid of managers. Some of the worst problems I've seen, little small meat packing plant, management's family, and what I have found on the really small, little tiny slaughterhouses, they're either really nice or they're really awful, because so much depends upon the personality of that manager. But if you want to improve all kinds of things, not just welfare, you've got to have management buy-in to doing things right. Okay?
Sorry. You next. You were talking about, electric lights and how they're used to, guide cattle forward. Could you Could you have a similar effect if you just had, one or two lights and then have a bunch of mirrors, or?
No, I don't think that's probably gonna work. Now, and there's people that have tried things like that. Where light works best is you've got a place where they're hard to get into, like in a chute. If you're inside a building where the eyes of the animal are adjusted to the light, I can use artificial light to attract them in. That's not going to work outside. The sun's 100 times brighter than any light, but I can use lights at night. I've had people where they couldn't get their animal loaded. I said, why don't you try loading the horse trailer at night? Put a light inside, track them in at night. That sometimes works really, really well. I've seen a lot of facilities where they're horrible in the daytime. They actually work really quite well at night, because then I can control things with artificial light. When I'm competing against the sun, I can't do that. If I've got the black hole effect, I got to get tin off. I got to get light in there. Okay?
I'm basically wondering if you've had any experience with the open air slaughterhouse facility type farms, polyface farms out in Virginia. They do natural pasture rotation. They slaughter their own animals out of
They're
doors,
slaughtering
sunlight.
chickens outside. The problem with with something like that may work on a very small scale, but on a large scale it would turn into an absolute filthy mess. You take like a big plant here like Hiram, they spend one whole shift cleaning it. And if you were to go in that plant at midnight, they spray all this stuff. It looks like 10,000 cans of shaving cream been put in there. Things that work on a small scale often won't work when you scale it up. Now, I think some of the things that Salatin's done on pasture rotation, I'm getting really interested in some of these intensive grazing things. I think this is where we can really do things with ruminant animals, because there's so much land in this country that cannot be cropped. And the only way you can grow food on that land is ruminants. And things where you're taking sheep and cattle together, the grazing things. I think there's things that we can learn from that, and we need to be working on promoting those sort of things. But let's say we slaughtered, commercial amounts of chickens outside, that'd be a complete mess, because you have no way to clean it.
My
Okay?
question is do you still horseback ride?
I don't now. My balance has gotten so bad, and I just can't hardly. I have trouble balancing.
Have you found a correlation between stress and dystocia or calving problems in animals?
Well, I think that I haven't researched that thing, but if the animal's scared and not relaxed around people, it's not going to want to calve. Cattle have a natural tendency to hide, when they're calving. You want to hide from the predator. So if the animal's viewing its caretakers as predators, then it's not going to want to calve. And that possibly could cause a problem with dystocia. It's very important that animals not be afraid of their caretakers. There's a scientist named Paul Hemsworth, and he's been doing research for years. And what he has found is animals that are afraid of their caretakers and have a big flight zone give less milk. Pigs have 8% less pigs. They're going to be less productive. You don't want to have farm animals that are afraid of their caretakers. You go in the dairy and all the cows run to the other end of the barn. That's not a good sign.
Dr. Grandin, I am an agricultural communications major, and I was excited to hear you talk a little bit about the message that we need to be spreading. What, in your opinion, are the most important messages that we can all share with the public, and what's the best way to do that?
I think we need to just show what we do. And the videos I put up on YouTube were training videos. They don't say that anything's wonderful. They just say, okay, to stun pigs correctly, this is how you do it. And that video's gotten to 1 million views. Now, you are going to have to police these sites for F-bombs. And what I have found is there's a small amount of people that write really vulgar stuff. And that you have to block and delete. But I don't take down dissent. If somebody said, be a vegan or meat's evil, I don't take that down. I don't take dissent down. But discussion has to be civil. Then the other thing is, when you write back, never type directly on the web page. That's too dangerous. You type it somewhere else, and then you transfer it over there the next day, because you don't want to be responding back in anger. But I think basically what we got to do, and I think the public's smarter than we think, is just open up the house and show what we do. That can be done electronically. We need putting videos up like things like, well, this is like taking care of calving on our ranch, and just explaining it and what we do, and writing stuff on there. Well, we're a family ranch. We're not a big bad, factory farm cattle. Better use those keywords, because when I go on YouTube, when I went on YouTube 2.5 years ago, I typed in cattle feedlot. I got nothing but bad stuff. Now I type in cattle feed yard or cattle feed lot, and I get normal stuff, like cattle eating out of the feed bunk, loaders scooping up grain. Now if I type in CAFO, I get bad stuff. So we're going to have to start using that keyword. But the public is actually hungry just to look at normal stuff. Now to us, a loader scooping grain is boring. But to some little 8-year-old kid, a loader scooping grain is pretty cool. We need to just show, we need to open up the house electronically and just show what we do. Not a lot of PR BS, but just, okay, this is what we do, and this is why we do it. And there's some practices we better clean up. And I'm getting very concerned about what I call biological system overload. We're pushing the dairy cow to where she's not breeding. Beef animals is jacked up on so many beta agonists that they've got hoof problems, they've got sore feet, and they've got heat stress. I saw 2 bad cases of this summer. And the thing that's really weird is if you have 3 truckloads of cattle, it doesn't affect all the animals evenly. It makes a few animals really messed up. A lot of the animals appear to be okay. Then about 20% are going to be sore-footed. I got problems with that. Lameness, feedlot cattle, I didn't think we'd ever get there. But we are now. You see, that's pushing the biology too hard. I'll go with measuring the outcome. But I don't want to see sore-footed cattle, and I better not see any tongues out. And those mouths open up, you got open mouths, they're hot. That's a very easy thing to score.
Dr. Grandin, my son wanted to ask you a question before, and he just wanted to hurry and ask that question now.
Okay.
How do you focus on one thing and keep yourself from focusing on your surroundings that's very distracting?
Well, first of all, you need a quiet place to do your homework, away from distracting. You need to put the phones away and things like that. I find when I've got to do something like write a serious article, I got to have a block of time of at least 4 hours where I can just sit down and work on that article, where you got to get rid of all the text messaging, rid of all the distractions, and you just concentrate on the thing you've got to get done. Over here. Okay?
Hi, I'm planning on becoming a rancher when I get older, and I want to know some tips on becoming one of the top bests.
How to become the best rancher?
Yeah.
Well, I'd recommend getting out and seeing as many ranches as possible, interning in the summer at different ranches. Travel's a great educator. And I learned some real lessons. Back when I first started, I thought everything we had in Arizona was wonderful. Then I went to Australia and I saw some of the most beautiful meat plants I'd ever seen. Get out and see as much stuff as you can see. The good, the bad, everything in between. The more stuff you see, that'll help you to be a better rancher.
Over here, Temple.
Okay. Oh, and then you might want to get my book, Humane Livestock Handling. You might want to get that. It's called Humane Livestock Handling.
What's your favorite dog?
Favorite dog? Well, I really like golden retrievers and Labradors very much. Right here. Okay.
I think everyone here would like to know how you like your steak cooked.
I like it medium rare. And I got no intention of giving up meat. And people ask me, how can I still be in the industry when there's things going on that are wrong? And in the epilogue, in the afterword of Animals Make Us Human, I discuss how did I manage to stay in the industry when cattle handling in the 70s was so awful? Because there were a few people that did things right. The other thing is, in Arizona, feed yards were not mud holes. They had shade. So even though the handling of cattle was really atrocious, cattle handling today is getting a lot better. The living conditions for those cattle were good. They had shade, and they weren't slogging around in the mud. If the cattle, back in my cattle formative years in the early 70s, had been slopping in this much mud, maybe my career might have gone somewhere else, but they weren't. And I could see the handling as something that I could fix, because there were some people that did things right.
One more question.
Okay.
I have an idea about how to help with stereotyping. I wonder if I could talk to you afterwards about that.
I mean, stereotyping about what?
Stereotyping I think that's not how you pronounce it, but stereotyping with zoo animals.
Okay. Well, actually, I addressed that issue in my book, Animals Make Us Human. And one of the things we talk about is you've got to look at what's motivating a behavior. Is it fear? Okay, if animals are having a problem during handling, that's fear. Then I talked about seeking, where they tend to approach the novelty. That's an emotional system in the brain. You can also have separation anxiety. You separate the calves. And they have the separation distress trait. You can have rage. Of course, you got sex, you got play, and you got the mother-young nurturing behavior. There's emotional systems in the brain. And grazing animals tend to develop mouth stereotypies, like cribbing. Because that's an animal that spends a lot of its life just grazing. Animals that are big seekers, like the polar bear, they do pacing. Gerbils that do compulsive digging, that's motivated by fear, because they're trying to dig a hole to get cover from the non-existent predators. So in that situation, the stereotypic behavior is driven by fear, where the polar bear is driven by seeking urge. And some people might say, well, that's not science, what you're talking about. But all these things on emotional systems in animals' brains, it's all in the neuroscience literature. See, this is where different literatures don't communicate with each other. Because the basic emotional systems like fear, separation distress, neuroscientists call it panic. I'm not a fan of that word because it gets mixed up with fear. Rage, says novelty seeking, and then sex, play, and mother-young nurturing. All of that stuff's been documented. Thousands of papers, but it's all in neuroscience. People tend to not read across disciplines. One thing I've tried to do my entire career, and I really recommend to students, read across disciplines. Don't just read the animal science stuff, read veterinary stuff, read neuroscience stuff. I get all these magazines, I get Science and Nature and all these things, and read all these newspapers and all this stuff, because really understand you need to get across disciplines.
A lot of this seems to be on confined cattle, slaughterhouses, and feed yards and whatnot. What about handling practices out in the open, auction yards and so forth?
Auction yards, that's one of the places where we still got a lot of problems. That is probably one of the worst segments of the industry. You see, and one of the problems you got there is they don't own the animal. You know, if it gets sick, then it's somebody else's problem. We're still getting way too many calves weaned on a truck. Well, if a rancher doesn't get a premium for pre-vaccinating and pre-weaning, then they're not going to do it. Cattle that are in a dedicated supply chain, those tend to get preconditioned and vaccinated, vaccination 45 days prior, all the things you're supposed to do. But there's still a lot of babies getting weaned on the trucks. And there seem to be regional differences in this. There's certain regions of the country where that's still a great big problem. And what happens there is it's a segmented market chain, so then you pass that sickness on to the next segment. There's somebody else's problem when they get sick 10 days later. Accountability for losses. When I first started, I can remember Bill Fleming, the editor of Beef, saying to me, it's all in economics. And I didn't believe him. And I have found that, you know, when McDonald's came in and put the power of McDonald's behind these audits, boy, things got cleaned up because a plant didn't want to get kicked off the approved supplier list. And one of the reasons why it worked is that the audit was very clear numerical scoring. You either pass it or you don't. And it worked beyond my wildest dreams. Frustrates me that most of the public doesn't know about it.
Thanks for coming, Dr. Grandin. You have just given us a presentation about how the meat production process can be made more efficient and more profitable, but I think it's ignoring the fundamental moral questions involved, which are use of animals for food and not just their treatment. If you had made the same arguments using dogs or cats as opposed to sheep's, dogs, or pigs, sheep's, cows, or pigs, we would have been equally horrified, you know, how do we make them bark less or meow less? And I think that I would just like to ask you, what's the fundamental difference between the dogs and cats we love and the animals that we stick our forks into?
Well, if you look at it from a neurological standpoint, things like brain encephalization, there isn't any difference. Now, I myself I couldn't be a vegan even if I wanted to be. I can't function on a vegan diet. Got the O positive blood type, get lightheaded if I don't eat, I'd have to at least eat eggs. I feel very strongly that we've got to treat animals right. And ruminant animals, you know, we've got all this land. I think the feeding of corn is going to end somewhere in the distant future. You know, we need to stop feeding it to ethanol plants. You get no net energy gain. You'd be better off feeding sugar beets to ethanol plants. But there's all this land. Only way you can raise food on that land is ruminants. There's no other way. You know, ruminants being cattle, sheep, goats, the grazing animals. Now, I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I thought, well, those cattle would never exist. I remember when I worked on my very first center track restrainer system, I stood on this big catwalk over a sea of cattle underneath me. I just had designed a really efficient system for killing cattle, and I thought none of those cattle would have been born. And we've got to give them a life that's worth living. That I feel very strongly about. The other thing that people forget is nature's not very nice. There's nothing nice about how wolves will dine on the live guts of an animal. Big cats, they'll kill you first. But the wolves don't. The canids just rip out the tummy and slurp up the nice warm guts. And, you know, maybe in the future, I mean, you know, we can just, if you wanted to grow meat artificially, you wouldn't use mammalian protein. You'd probably just grow scallops without shells. I don't have to worry about scallop welfare. There's not enough nervous system there to worry about. You know, scallops. And they're cold-blooded, so it's a lot more energy efficient to raise animal protein as scallops rather than, you know, I know that PETA's worked on funding, you know, artificial mammalian protein. That's not the way to go. Energy expenditure is way too high. You know, a warm-blooded mussel has to take in a lot more food than fish would because it's cold-blooded. Warm-blooded metabolism is energy expensive. And, you know, you can argue a lot of different moral things, but I've decided that we can use animals ethically for food. A lot of things that still got to be changed. I'm very concerned about this biological system overload. I see some pigs coming in that are so weak they can't walk off the truck up through the stockyards. It makes me really mad. I see sore-footed cattle. That's not okay. Now, there's some people that think we shouldn't use animals at all for anything. Well, people have been with animals for many years. I found an interesting scientific paper where people's brains, when they see animals, that kind of turns on the brain more than maybe trees or some other thing. And there's some people really into strict animal rights who think that you shouldn't even have pets. You know, because you're exploiting a pet. Do you really want to be in a world where there's people that do nothing with animals? And if you want to save all the wildlife, we're going to have to manage it. You see, in looking at making change, there's two kinds of people. You know, what made McDonald's originally do something? It was the McLibel suit. You can look that up on the internet. Heat softens steel. The activist groups can soften the steel, and then implementers like me can bend it into pretty grill work. And in looking at some of these issues, you get into things, well, am I going to be a reformer and try to fix the meat industry, or do you want to get rid of it? Well, there's some people that feel that we need to just get rid of it. I don't happen to agree with that. I'm a reformer. And I've been seeing some of the stuff that some of the activist groups are doing now is pretty destructive. Also, I'm a totally practical person. I want to fix things on the ground. What's your major? Okay. All I can say is, don't make your policies so abstract. Okay, the humane groups shut down the horse slaughter plants. Let me tell you the mess you've got now. They're all going down to Mexico, and they're going into something that's just so bad. They got their wish, and they shut them down. But the horses are getting a fate a lot worse than slaughter in the United States. It's absolutely a disaster. And there's no control. Once they go over that border, there's no control. You think you can close that border? You're smoking weed. because it's Homeland Security is a one-way valve. I've been to the border. You can go in, and it's a 3-hour passport hassle coming back out. And they'll just launder them as riding and breeding horses. Sealing the border is impossible. Where are you going to get the funding to put up the other side of the valve on? Homeland Security. Because that'd be the only way you could seal the border. We've got to make sure that whatever policies we have, we don't get so far away from the ground. See, I'm a bottom-up thinker. Let's look at other issues like education and health care. People argue over whether it's this kind of medicine or that kind of medicine. You know what? I don't want to talk about abstractions. What do we do about the lady whose teeth are rotting? Can't get basic health care. What do we do about that? I don't want to talk about abstractions. You see, as a visual thinker, I'm totally not abstract. Totally. I'm only into making real change on the ground. When mother says to me, well, my kid went to college because of something he'd read in my book, that makes me happy. Or another mom, I wrote about acid reflux problems and nonverbal individuals with autism. The kid can sleep now because they gave him some acid reflux medicine. Okay, that made positive change on the ground. You see, this is where you have the different kinds of minds. You have things totally in the abstract. There's people in the world that heat the steel, and there's people in the world that bend the steel, that implement. And the thing that worries me today, a lot of policy things, are things are getting so abstract that we're doing messes like that horse slaughter thing. It's a mess. Yeah, they got their wish and made a real mess. You got to make sure that what you do doesn't make a real mess in the practical world. So whatever you want to get involved in, you're getting involved in much practical stuff, anything practical. I'm very concerned today that people are getting away from practical things. They've taken hands-on classes out of the schools, and one of the reasons why we have so much trouble with the government right now is you've got people coming out of college with degrees in poli-sci. They've never done anything practical. Build anything, worked in a hospital, worked with people that are in poverty, done practical stuff. Okay, I think we'll end on that, and thank you all for coming.